Greenburgh, New York, a serene suburban haven just north of New York City. In the late 1980s, it was the kind of town where neighbors knew each other by name and life moved at an unhurried pace. Families thrived here, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But even in the most peaceful places, darkness can take root. Among the town's residents were Paul and Betty Jeanne Solomon. Paul, a charismatic and well-liked high school teacher, was a figure many admired. His wife, Betty Jeanne, was his opposite in many ways, practical, hardworking, and fiercely devoted to her family. Together, they seemed to embody the suburban dream. But behind the picture-perfect facade, cracks were forming, cracks that would soon give way to tragedy. 911, what's your emergency? January 15, 1989, the tranquility of Greenburgh was shattered. Police responded to a frantic 911 call, arriving at the Solomon home to a scene of unimaginable violence. Betty Jeanne Solomon had been brutally murdered, shot 9 times in what appeared to be a crime of unbridled rage. The question was no longer about what had happened, but why, and who could commit such an unspeakable act. This is the story of obsession, betrayal, and a crime that would captivate the nation. A story that begins with a seemingly perfect life and ends in cold-blooded murder. At just 25 years old, Carolyn Warmus seemed to have it all. A substitute teacher at Greenville Elementary School in Greenburgh, she was intelligent, polished, and came from a life of privilege. But beneath her poised exterior lay a far darker reality. Born into wealth, Carolyn was accustomed to getting what she wanted. Her father, a successful insurance executive, provided her with every advantage. Yet, Carolyn's personal life was far from stable. Failed relationships and emotional instability plagued her, leaving a trail of turmoil wherever she went. It was at Greenville Elementary School that Carolyn Warmus met Paul Solomon, a fellow teacher 15 years her senior. Paul's charm and confidence captivated Carolyn, sparking an attraction that quickly spiraled into obsession. Carolyn wasn't just infatuated with Paul, she was consumed by him. Their affair began in secrecy, with late-night rendezvous and whispered promises. Carolyn showered Paul with lavish gifts, expensive watches, tailored suits, and even trips to tropical destinations. In her mind, they were soulmates, destined to be together. But while Carolyn envisioned a future with Paul, there was one obstacle she couldn't ignore: his wife, Betty Jeanne. What began as infatuation soon morphed into something far more sinister. Driven by jealousy and desperation, Carolyn's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She followed Paul and his wife, spied on their home, and began to fixate on removing Betty Jeanne from the picture entirely. Carolyn Warmus was no longer just the other woman. She was a woman on a dangerous path, willing to do whatever it took to claim what she believed was hers, no matter the cost. The affair between Paul Solomon and Carolyn Warmus was as passionate as it was destructive. Their relationship, fueled by secrecy and thrill, unfolded in private corners of Greenburgh, hidden from the prying eyes of their colleagues, neighbors, and most importantly, Betty Jeanne Solomon. Carolyn showered Paul with gifts, promising him a life of luxury and devotion. Paul, in turn, made her feel desired, feeding her fantasies of a future together. But while Carolyn saw their relationship as destined, Paul's feelings were more complex. Betty Jeanne Solomon wasn't blind to her husband's behavior. His late nights, secretive phone calls, and sudden distance began to raise alarms. The tension between them grew, but Paul continued to play both sides, reluctant to confront the truth. With each passing day, Carolyn's desire for Paul deepened, but so did her resentment toward Betty Jeanne. Carolyn began to see her as the one thing standing in the way of her happiness, a rival she couldn't ignore. As Carolyn's jealousy festered, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She began calling Paul incessantly, leaving notes on his car, and following him to places he thought were private. What started as a love affair was turning into an obsession. Paul, sensing the danger, tried to pull away. He began to distance himself, hoping to end the affair without further conflict. But Carolyn refused to let go. To her, their relationship wasn't just love, it was destiny, and destiny in her eyes couldn't be denied. "You told me you loved me, Paul. You said we'd be together. Was that all a lie?" "I never promised you anything, Carolyn. This has to stop." Paul's rejection only fueled Carolyn's determination. What had begun as an affair of passion was spiraling into something far more dangerous, an obsession that would soon reach a tipping point. Carolyn Warmus wasn't ready to let go, and as her desperation grew, so did her resolve to eliminate the one thing standing in her way, Betty Jeanne Solomon. January 15, 1989 began like any other winter day in Greenburgh. But for Carolyn Warmus, it marked the culmination of her growing obsession and jealousy. Her actions that day would leave an indelible stain on the town's history. In the early hours, Carolyn purchased a .25 caliber pistol and a pair of gloves, items that would later become key pieces of evidence in a chilling and calculated plan. Meanwhile, Betty Jeanne Solomon was at home, unaware of the danger closing in. Paul had left earlier to meet friends at a local bar, leaving Betty Jeanne to spend the evening by herself. Carolyn drove to the Solomons' home, parking a short distance away. Whether she planned to confront Betty Jeanne or if her intentions were already murderous remains a point of debate, but what happened next was undeniable. "Can I help you?" What followed was an act of unimaginable violence. Carolyn shot Betty Jeanne Solomon 9 times, leaving her lifeless on the living room floor. The brutality of the attack spoke to the rage and desperation driving Carolyn that night. Carolyn fled the scene, leaving behind a gruesome tableau of shattered lives. Betty Jeanne's final moments were ones of terror and pain, a tragic end to a life filled with love and dedication. As Carolyn disappeared into the night, the pieces of her plan began to unravel. What she believed was a perfect crime would soon lead to her unmasking as the architect of a cold-blooded murder. The murder of Betty Jeanne Solomon would ignite a case filled with intrigue, betrayal, and obsession, a case that would expose the darkest corners of the human heart. The murder of Betty Jeanne Solomon shocked the quiet suburb of Greenburgh. As news spread, the police launched an intense investigation, determined to piece together the events of that fateful night. What they uncovered painted a chilling picture of obsession and betrayal. The first breakthrough came in the form of physical evidence. A black leather glove, seemingly out of place, was found near the crime scene. Ballistics later confirmed that Betty Jeanne had been killed with a .25 caliber handgun, exactly like the one Carolyn Warmus had purchased shortly before the murder. Phone records proved even more damning. Carolyn's calls to Paul were relentless in the days leading up to the murder, but one call stood out. A call made from a location near the Solomon home on the night of Betty Jeanne's death. As detectives delved deeper, they discovered witnesses who spoke of Carolyn's erratic and possessive behavior. Her obsession with Paul Solomon was no longer a secret. "Ms. Warmus, can you explain why your phone records place you near the Solomon home that night?" "I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't there." Despite mounting evidence, Carolyn maintained her innocence, but her facade began to crack when detectives linked her glove and gun to the crime. "We've identified key evidence tying a suspect to the crime. This is a developing case and will pursue justice for Betty Jeanne Solomon." But Carolyn wasn't the only person under scrutiny. Paul Solomon's own behavior raised eyebrows. Detectives discovered he had delayed calling 911 after returning home and had provided inconsistent accounts of his actions that evening. "Mr. Solomon, did you have any role in your wife's death? How do you respond to claims about your affair with Carolyn Warmus?" Though suspicions briefly fell on Paul, the evidence against Carolyn Warmus became impossible to ignore. Her jealousy, her proximity to the crime scene, and her erratic behavior painted a picture of a woman willing to kill for love. With each new revelation, the case against Carolyn Warmus tightened. But as the trial loomed, the question remained, would justice prevail in this tale of passion turned deadly? The trial of Carolyn Warmus, dubbed the Fatal Attraction murder, captivated the nation. With its mix of love, lies, and obsession, it felt ripped straight from a Hollywood script. And much like the movie Fatal Attraction, It revealed the darkest corners of desire and betrayal. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of obsession, a dangerous, consuming obsession. Carolyn Warmus couldn't have Paul Solomon, so she decided to eliminate the one person standing in her way, Betty Jeanne Solomon. The prosecution painted Carolyn as a woman scorned, driven to madness by rejection. They argued that her fixation on Paul Solomon consumed her, turning her into a cold-blooded killer. She was obsessed with Paul. She talked about him constantly like they were soulmates, but it wasn't love. It was something darker. And what about Paul Solomon, a man who lied to his wife, to his mistress, and to the police? Can we trust his version of events? Or is Carolyn Warmus simply the scapegoat for a crime no one truly understands? The defense focused on raising doubt. They argued that Paul Solomon's questionable behavior made him a suspect and claimed the evidence against Carolyn was circumstantial at best. Ms. Warmus, did you kill Betty Jeanne Solomon? No, I didn't. I loved Paul, but I would never hurt anyone. This has all been a misunderstanding. But Carolyn's own testimony betrayed her. Her calm detachment, paired with chilling admissions about her obsession with Paul, left the jury grappling with her true nature. This glove, this gun, these records, they all tell the same story. Carolyn Warmus couldn't have Paul Solomon, so she took Betty Jeanne's life. Obsession is not love, and justice must not be blinded by her lies. The trial became a media spectacle, with every twist and turn dissected in real time. Comparisons to the film Fatal Attraction fueled the frenzy, casting Carolyn as a real-life version of Glenn Close's unhinged character. As the jury deliberated, the nation held its breath. Would they see Carolyn as a victim of circumstantial evidence, or as a woman who allowed her obsession to spiral into murder? After weeks of dramatic testimony, conflicting narratives, and a media frenzy, the moment of truth arrived. The nation held its breath as the jury prepared to deliver its verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Carolyn Warmus, guilty of murder in the second degree. On January 23, 1991, Carolyn Warmus was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The verdict marked the end of a sensational trial but left lingering questions in its wake. The case has divided the public. Was Carolyn Warmus a calculating, cold-blooded killer, or a scapegoat caught in a web of deceit and betrayal? She was obsessed. You don't stalk someone and buy a gun for nothing. She deserved to be convicted. The evidence was weak. Paul Solomon had motive too, and his story doesn't add up. Carolyn's a victim in all this. Even from behind bars, Carolyn maintained her innocence, claiming she had been unfairly targeted and insisting that she was framed. I didn't kill Betty Jeanne. I loved Paul, but I wasn't the one who took his wife's life. The truth will come out someday. Over the decades, Carolyn filed numerous appeals, arguing that new evidence could exonerate her. Each attempt was met with the same result: rejection. Yet her story remained a subject of fascination, fueling documentaries, books, and endless debate. For the family of Betty Jeanne Solomon, the conviction brought some closure but could never heal the wounds left by her tragic death. Carolyn's fate, meanwhile, became a symbol of the complexities of justice and the enduring consequences of obsession. The story of Carolyn Warmus is a haunting reminder of what happens when love turns to obsession and passion spirals into tragedy. Whether viewed as a killer or a victim, her legacy is forever entwined with the shadow of the crime that shocked a nation. The murder of Betty Jeanne Solomon and the conviction of Carolyn Warmus left a scar on a quiet suburb, but its echoes resonated far beyond Greenburgh. At its core, this case wasn't just about a love triangle. It was a cautionary tale of unchecked obsession, emotional instability, and the consequences of lives spiraling out of control. Carolyn Warmus had every advantage: a privileged upbringing, intelligence, and wealth. But beneath the surface, her emotional instability and deep-seated insecurities fueled a dangerous obsession. In her mind, Paul Solomon wasn't just a lover, he was the key to the perfect life she envisioned for herself. The media played no small role in shaping public perception of the case. The comparison to Fatal Attraction wasn't just a convenient headline. It became a lens through which the world saw Carolyn Warmus. Her every action was scrutinized, dramatized, and reduced to the archetype of a woman scorned. This is a real-life fatal attraction. Carolyn Warmus didn't just want Paul Solomon, she wanted to erase his wife from the picture entirely. But is it that simple? Aren't we sensationalizing a tragedy and turning it into entertainment? Cases like this underscore the dangers of untreated emotional instability. Carolyn exhibited classic signs of obsessive behavior, idealizing Paul, fixating on their future, and viewing Jeanne as an obstacle rather than a person. Obsession isn't love, it's control disguised as devotion. Carolyn's privileged background made her descent into violence even more shocking. How could someone with so much throw it all away for an illicit affair? Her story revealed that wealth and privilege are no shields against deep emotional turmoil. At the heart of this tragedy was a woman who deserved none of it. Jeanne Solomon wasn't just a victim of Carolyn's obsession. She was a wife, a mother, and a person whose life was stolen in a moment of senseless violence. As society, we must recognize the signs of unhealthy obsession before they escalate. Love should never blur into control, and passion should never descend into violence. In 2019, after serving 27 years in prison, Carolyn Warmus was granted parole. She had spent nearly 3 decades behind bars, maintaining her innocence despite the conviction that had defined her life. After nearly 3 decades, Carolyn Warmus is now free, but the question remains, will she ever be able to truly escape the shadow of the crime that made her infamous? I never killed Jeanne, I've always said that. I don't know why I was targeted, but I've never stopped fighting for my freedom and the truth. Since her release, Carolyn has used her newfound freedom to advocate for criminal justice reform, highlighting what she believes to be flaws in the system. Her story remains a point of contention. Some see her as a victim of a broken system, while others view her as a woman who had the chance to reflect on her actions but failed to accept responsibility. The system needs to change. There are so many people like me, caught in circumstances beyond their control but labeled and discarded as criminals without a chance for redemption. The legacy of the Carolyn Warmus case is a complex one. It's a story of love twisted into obsession, of lives shattered by unchecked passion, and a cautionary tale about the consequences of losing control. As time has passed, opinions have shifted, but the impact of this case remains. The tragedy of Jeanne Solomon is inescapable, and Carolyn's story serves as a reminder that obsession, no matter how deep or passionate, can lead to devastating consequences. In the end, Carolyn Warmus's release is not just the closing chapter of a long and contentious legal battle, it's a reminder that some stories don't have easy answers. The shadow of the crime she committed and the lives it ruined will follow her for as long as she seeks redemption. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more true crime mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss another journey into the shadows. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we uncover more untold stories.